grant system is once again under intense scrutiny. The Universal Basic Income Coalition, and that's an alliance of civil society organizations, including Black Sash, has written an urgent appeal to South Africa's Parliament, warning that new conditions imposed by National Treasury could devastate the country's most vulnerable. Now, these conditions, revealed in a recent parliamentary presentation, would require SASSA to implement harsh and intrusive verification systems across all major social grants, including those for children, the elderly, and people with disabilities. The UBIC argue that these measures violate constitutional rights and could lead to the wrongful exclusion of millions of people. Now, the coalition is demanding immediate intervention, transparency around the long-delayed basic income support policy, and also a halt to what it calls the mass digitized denial of life-sustaining income. Well, to unpack some of these issues and concerns and what's at stake, we're now joined by Hoodah Abrahams-Fayker, who's the National Advocacy Manager at Black Sash, and that's one of the key organizations behind this call. Thanks so much indeed for joining us, and welcome to the program.
Thank you for inviting the coalition to share our work.
All right, let's start with this urgent appeal that UBIC has made to Parliament. What's exactly triggered this intervention now?
Well, I think as a coalition, we've been advocating for the social relief of distress grant to become permanent. However, since its inception, there has been challenges with access to the grant. Now, to add to that, a government, or more so National Treasury, wants to create reforms whereby these exclusionary measures that apply to the SRD grant also they want to have applied to other grants. And this will devastate the social grant system. We have high unemployment, inequality, and poverty. And people depend on these social grants as a lifeline. So if the SRD grant systems are going to be used, there will definitely be exclusion on high levels.
So talk to us a little bit about some of these conditions that you've described as intrusive and potentially unconstitutional. Explain what these entail and why you consider them so harmful.
Well, the grants are permanent grants, and when someone applies for these grants, they would then qualify and then receive these grants. However, now 210,000 grants have been suspended across the board in terms of these permanent grants. And this involves the fact that they have flagged this as potentially social grant beneficiaries receiving other income. However, in order for this to be flagged, they have done invasive bank surveillance and use of credit bureau data to indicate that these social grant beneficiaries may be receiving income from other sources. However, it is important to note that especially the government databases like UIF and NSFAS are inaccurate and not up to date in real time.
Some might argue that these verification systems are necessary to root out fraud. How would you respond to that?
Well, I think if it's a transparent and open process, if there is a fraud risk, the first option must be that social grant beneficiaries must be informed that there is the surveillance, whether they've been given consent to be able to do that. Secondly, they must be given notice that the grants are going to be suspended. And then furthermore, the SASSA is placing an obligation on social grants to prove to the contrary. However, they're not even sure what the reason is for being flagged. So the process is not transparent and open, and beneficiaries are then having the burden to prove that they still need the grants.
So one of the alarming claims, and it's quite shocking actually, is that up to 90% of SRD grant exclusions since 2022 were actually errors. Is that even possible? What systems are failing here if that's true?
Well, it's an online system. So with an online system, there is not an opportunity for social grant beneficiaries to counter the inaccurate databases that are used. So, for example, students have been excluded from 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 receiving the grant because the NSFAS database is not updated. So they are no longer students, they are unemployed. However, the NSFAS database shows that they are still on the system. So when there's that initial exclusion, there's not an opportunity for that applicant to counter the application, appeal that application in a way to mitigate and submit new evidence. They use those same databases to verify whether that person, qualifies for the grant. And this is in line with the fact that every time the budget for this SRD grant is smaller and is aligned with the fiscal constraints on DSD and SASSA. So what happens is the eligibility criteria gets narrower and stricter in terms of the application and eligibility process.
We're also hearing about grant beneficiaries being suspended or placed under review without notice. Tell us about what that might mean for recipients on the ground.
Well, it will mean a lot, obviously, because as I said, to live in the country that we are in now, where unemployment is very high, people depend on this grant as a lifeline. So they expect to receive the monthly grant every month. Although the amount is small, it is still something that they use to pay for their basic needs. And now you suddenly have these grants suspended without notification. They then don't have money to put food on the table and attend to their basic needs. That's the lived reality with this blanket suspension.
All right, we're running out of time, but perhaps a final word in terms of what you see as what must be done.
Well, I think it's important. We've written a letter to the Portfolio Committee on Social Development as the oversight body to really interrogate what is happening, especially the fact that National Treasury is unilaterally introducing these reforms without opportunities for public consultation, where civil society and the coalition can respond to what is being introduced.
That's where we'll leave it. Thank you so much indeed for joining us and pointing out these very important issues. Thanks for your time, Hoodah.
Thank you so much for having the coalition.
Thank you. That's Hoodah Abrahams-Fayker, who's the National Advocacy Manager at Black Sash, one of the key members of the Universal Basic Income Coalition, with concerns for many grant recipients about some of the acts that are being taken by National Treasury here in South Africa.
Israeli forces have taken command